It's an honor and pleasure to be with you. Thank you very much for the invitation. So, as I mentioned, my main turf is Czech Academy of Sciences, the Institute of Psychology. I'm also affiliated with San Diego State University in the USA. I am not a statistician, so I'm mentioning here also that some part of this work I'll be referring to is done by statisticians, colleagues Jelinek and Kveton from our institute in Prague. I'll try to talk today about the psychopolitical mentalities and collective identities, about two studies. One, I think I should move the, maybe I can, I'll put us away. Yeah, two studies. The first is the European Psychopolitical Mentalities study. That's a bit older and brand new and has been published. The second one is brand new. It's the group mentalities derived from COVID and Russian propaganda disinformation. And that is a study that is focused on the Czech Republic. Perhaps an inspiration to it was a study that you probably know. It's a study by Engelhardt and Welzel. It's the World Cultural Map, really a genius way how to transform data from the World Values Survey into cultural map, a map that is defined by, on the axis X, we have, it is from the survival, it's a dimension coming from survival to self-expression values, kind of a Maslowian hierarchy dimension. And the second axis, Y, is goes from traditionalism to secularism. And in a fantastic way, they really converted the data from the World Values Survey into cultural map that is putting each country to a place defined by those two axes. And miraculously, there is we see the third axis that goes across that really puts countries into some kind of a space, or maybe hierarchy, if you want, according to the political system, from autocracy to democracy. I was very impressed when I saw this, and but for a psychologist, from a psychological point of view, it seems that there is something lacking. For example, if you look at the United States here, among the English-speaking countries, I don't personally actually know anyone who would really belong here to this space. I know many people from the universities that would be fitting more the ideology and mentality of Protestant Europe. Or if you go outside of the cities and out of the coasts to the country, you may meet someone who is more like someone from Latin America. So my point is that this is a fantastic, genius map, but from the psychological point of view of mentalities or ideologies, it seems that a finer approach would be better. Also, we also know that well, we can talk of some model national character, but we can also have kind of a finer view at people and thinking about anti-democratic, authoritarian character, democratic character, or post-totalitarian, post-communist syndrome, post-communist mentality that I also coined some time ago. So as a psychologist or social psychologist, political psychologist, I suggest a finer view. And that is what we did in this European Psychopolitical Mentalities study. Together with Dr. Kostal, a sociologist, we were not ambitious enough to do the world and repeat Engelhardt and Welzel, but we tried to have a finer look at European values study. We used European values study dataset, 44 European countries, 63,000 respondents that made a couple of million of data, actually. We selected 73 relevant variables that were relevant to democratic character, and which included tolerance, democratic spirit, religiousness, and questions and responses of that type. My colleague Kostal converted the data to Z-scores, performed cluster analysis, which may be a little bit outdated at this time, but still, I think the data and the results are interesting. He used k-means hierarchical cluster analysis. He came to 5 types, and let me briefly show you through them. So this is the matrix, a very simplified matrix, because we had 73 items, and here you see just, I don't know, a dozen of them, and the data that belong to it. So let's walk through it briefly. You see the results for 5 clusters, for 5 types. The first 2 are very similar. You see the green means kind of pro-democratic orientation. Democracy is good. Yeah, they both scored very high. Will vote at election. Yes, certainly much more than the other 3 types. People can be trusted. The first type especially very much so. People try to be helpful. Yeah, in general, very benevolent view of the mankind. And here's a big difference. Belief in God. This is fairly secular cluster, fairly secular type. And this one is very religious. And this is also, this religiousness is also reflected in a little bit of conservatism and bigotry. If you compare the first and second column, gays and undesirable neighbors, not in the first liberal type, but yeah, somewhat in the conservative type. Divorce justifiable, quite a difference. Different race, undesirable, somewhat of a difference. Desiring a strong leader, the liberals certainly not. Desiring army rule, certainly not. The conservatives slightly more accepting that. So we named these 2 types. Excuse me. We named these 2 types as Democrats. The first secular, more liberal, and the second religious, a little bit more conservative. Where did we find them? Most of all in Scandinavia. You see, for example, in Denmark, which is a striking example, 2/3 of the sample from Denmark responded as secular Democrats. And who was not a secular Democrat was religious Democrat. So you see very prevalent, absolute prevalence of democratic character, at least as they showed themselves, manifested themselves in the questionnaire. Ireland, on the other hand, would be an example of a country where we found absolute prevalence of religious democracy. The third type is quite different. The blue signifies kind of a medium, middle of the road responses. But what is most striking here is democracy is good. Not at all. I mean, these people are very lukewarm toward democracy. Actually, most lukewarm from all the 5 types. Most cynical or skeptical to it. Will vote at election. I will not bother. Very often people would say that they wouldn't bother, or they would be kind of middle of the road. People can be trusted, not that much. People try to be helpful, kind of middle of the road. Am I concerned with sick people around? Ostentatiously less than other 5 types. Belief in God, kind of halfway. Gays, undesirable, relatively tolerant, not much. Kind of middle of the road responses. But what is most striking is that kind of a cynical or skeptical view, I would say, rather than cynical view of democracy. We call them non-democratic skeptics. And where did we find them? right at home in Central Europe, in post-communist Europe, in Hungary, but Czechs were very close to it. So the post-communist region, you see, Czech Republic is very similar to Hungary in the number of those gray, non-democratic skeptics. It has more, secular Democrats, only 4% and 18% in Czech Republic. That's better, but that skepticism is pretty much similar. Just a note, cautionary note, all these numbers impress as being exact, but as we all know, surveys and statistics and everything, this is really kind of a assessment rather than measurement. In Slovakia, non-democratic skeptics were less frequent. Religious Democrats were more numerous than secular Democrats, but Slovaks had quite a lot of this green type. Of course, you have a hint here, intolerant traditionalists, how they look in the data. Belief in God is most striking, highest from all the types. And with it also bigotry, great deal of bigotry toward gays and divorce and all the modern lifestyles, desiring a strong leader, fairly high. People can be trusted, not at all, very little. People try to be helpful, not that much, but concern with the sick, kind of parochial way of good care for the neighbor, good care for each other. So I don't want to say that this traditionalist type is undesirable. Well, from the point of view of democracy, it certainly is very questionable. But to live among these people can be quite nice because they will take care of you perhaps more than the others, unless you are gay or a foreigner. So we call them intolerant traditionalists. And from our sample, Turkey was by far most representative of that type, especially women in the rural areas. Let's jump for the last from the types. What is striking here, very high religious belief and very high desire for a strong leader and for army rule and for more aggressive ways of political participation. Where did we find them in Europe? These religious radicals, what we called religious radicals. Interestingly enough, in the former Yugoslavia, in the war zones, where there were very, very high unrest in the 90s. That means Macedonia, Kosovo, and interestingly enough, authoritarian activists are also more represented than elsewhere in Central Europe and in Europe, in Poland. But Kosovo and Macedonia were the kind of focal points. So this was just a little walk through these mentalities. This is a little review. So then you see how dramatically the nations differed. But let me stress one thing, that this approach is nice because it not only compares internationally, but it also has that view inside of the individual countries. That means all 5 mentalities that we identified were represented in all the countries that we studied, all the 44 European countries. So there are differences, but there are also international mentalities that people share. So the left 2 are the democratic characters, secular and religious, especially in Scandinavia and Western Europe. In established democracies, they constituted, without exception, they constituted majority. In post-communist countries, in those more technically advanced, as Hungary and Czech Republic, non-democratic skepticism was very high. Turkey was an example of intolerant traditionalism, and in the war zone of ex-Yugoslavia, of authoritarian activism. And here is just one more glance. I hope you remember those color codes a little bit. Here you see this is kind of a lump look at the clusters of the countries. So established democracies of North and West, absolute prevalence of those blue democratic two types. Post-communist Central Europe, prevalence of non-democratic skepticism. Ex-Soviet Baltic states, also at that time there was that high non-democratic skepticism prevalent. Post-Yugoslavia, those authoritarian radicals. And post-Soviet core, at that time we took Belarus, Moldova, Russia, and Ukraine as one into one group. We see a very high intolerant traditionalism followed by that non-democratic skepticism. And one last glance, and I will part with this first study. It was interesting to look at the West and East Germany, although it was a generation after the split, after the reunification and after the democratic revolution. There was still, and I believe there still is, we see it in the elections, a difference between new and old lands of Germany. West Germany, actually the most striking difference is that West Germany has much more of religious Democrats. That's the majority of people, not majority, plurality. 42% as religious Democrats, most striking, most prevalent mentality in West Germany. Of course, that's much smaller percentage in post-communist country. And here we see as the most important mentality, the non-democratic skepticism. So that explains a lot, even at the current elections that are happening these days in Germany. So you see resonance with political culture categories, democratic mentality, of course, democratic core, sophisticated, active, tolerant, and civil people, authoritarian tendencies in those especially religious activists, parochial mentality in those. This is the whole Europe. No, this is actually no. Sorry, this is this slice is for Czech Republic, so I apologize. But anyway. Parochial mentality represents the green intolerant traditionalism, and the post-totalitarian mentality, post-communist syndrome is the gray. So this is, I apologize, this is Czech, but it shows the resonance with political culture. And these types have also resonance with resistance to disinformation. And now I would jump to the second study. Group mentality is derived from COVID and Russian propaganda disinformation. The data set is very different from what I was showing you in that European research. This is focused exclusively on Czech Republic. When COVID started, I started a study that was documenting the event. I didn't know that it will develop in a longitudinal study, because with next waves of COVID, I continued in collecting the data with that same sample. And then, so I started with COVID, but then Ukraine happened, Russian invasion to Ukraine happened, and I managed to get the funding, and we continue with the research until still. Anyway, so I have data about COVID disinformation, COVID misinformation, and also about Ukraine. And disinformation about, I have plenty of medical, psychological, sociological, etc. variables on plus minus 1,000 respondents. And what we did is, first we selected relevant COVID and Russia-Ukraine items that would relate to disinformation. So 12 a dozen questions on COVID, coming from disinformation, whether masks are useful and how much infectious COVID is, up to questions about Bill Gates and 5G mobile network and experimentation on humans. and 18 items about attitudes to the war in Ukraine. To what degree is it unjustifiable act of aggression, or whether Ukraine is nationalistic and fascist? To what degree NATO started it, and whether we should sacrifice for help to Ukraine, whether we should send weapons, etc. And also about whether the Russians are co-responsible or should be blamed for the event. So we took those 12 plus 18 items. We did run factor analysis, and interestingly, factor analysis yielded 4 factors. One was COVID hoaxes, the single COVID factor of all the whole dozen of COVID items transformed to a single COVID factor, and 3 factors that related to Russian-Ukraine conflict: pro-Russian politics, self-centered economy, and most Russians guilty. These 3 factors. So pro-Russian politics, for example, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is not unjustifiable act of aggression, or Ukraine should be part of Russia. That is an example. These are the strongest items from the pro-Russian politics factor. Then self-centered, actually anti-Ukrainian economy. The strongest items. Our politicians are helping the Ukrainians more than our own people, or anti-Russian sanctions ultimately hurt us more than Russia. And the third little factor, just 2 items, most Russians are guilty or responsible. Almost all Russians bear responsibility for what is happening in Ukraine now. So we have these 4 main factors that represent the disinformation narratives. Of course, the first thing was that we looked at the correlation. It's not surprising that pro-Russian politics and anti-Ukrainian self-centered, selfish economy correlate pretty high. But interestingly, for a researcher close to it, 0.47, extremely high correlation between COVID hoaxes and COVID disinformation and pro-Russian politics. So next step was that we took those factor loadings obtained from factor analysis, and we analyzed them using latent profile analysis to get the typology of individuals that relate to those attitudes. So this looks a little bit busy, but it is exactly the same table as this one, except here we see the correlation coefficients. And here you see it's exactly the same setup. We have not only the correlations and the correlation trends, but actually individual responses. If you have good enough monitor, if you have good enough enlargement, you can actually observe individual responses to COVID hoaxes and beliefs. This is rejection, plus is acceptance. Pro-Russian politics, plus is acceptance, minus is rejection. So here is a little bit of an explanation of the very high correlation between COVID hoaxes beliefs and pro-Russian politics beliefs. You see that it's not that much. One has a feeling like, oh, COVID hoaxes and pro-Russian politics are so closely related. But you see that the correlation is not done that much by people who believe in those things, but more by people who reject both of them. So especially rejection of COVID hoaxes and rejection of pro-Russian politics makes the kind of a heavy point of this correlation. What I love about this table or graph by Martin and Peter is that it doesn't only show this correlation and the general trends, but if your monitor is good enough, if your screen is good enough, you see also the crystallizing opinion clusters. You see that the dots and crosses and circles are in 5 different colors. And so you see the budding mentalities and their centers of gravity. And for example, what is perhaps most striking here is that kind of a pro-Russian and anti-Ukrainian center where Russian guilt is absolutely rejected, and self-centered anti-Ukrainian economy is professed. What is in the blue dots are showing people who reject COVID beliefs, or blue circles, and who reject pro-Russian politics. But you see what is interesting here, and here the correlations were also weaker. The blue circles are spread. They are not focused as the red circles. So people who reject pro-Russian politics are not quite agreeing on the concept of collective guilt. The dark blue circles here, you see they are spread, all of them without exception, in all 3 cells they are spread. But these turquoise ones are concentrating. They see the Russian guilt. So this constitutes that separate cluster, separate class, separate profile or mentality, ideology that blames Russians in general, or sees their responsibility in general. The generally disinformed people, those who believe in COVID hoaxes and pro-Russian politics, are marked in yellow. You see that they are again clustering together in yellow. So this is a 2-dimensional view. Again, it's the same as this table, just more detailed and more psychological in a way. So let's jump from the two-dimensional view to more dimensional view. Again, we shall do interpretation of those latent profile analysis statistics. We shall use the same 4 factors as before, and I will just guide you through fast through the 5 types that we discovered using the 4 main factors. Again, the 4 main factors are here by the axis: COVID hoaxes, the single COVID factor, and the 3 Russian-Ukraine factors: pro-Russian politics, self-centered economy, and most Russians are guilty. And the first type, by the way, I also marked this graph by thickness. So the thickest type represents actually half of the population. That was kind of either lukewarm or didn't want to express their feelings too much, or maybe they didn't take care of the questionnaire very seriously. In any case, 48% of the sample express their views in a very neutral or kind of non-explicit way. Let's have a look at them here. So all those scores around average characterize type that we called no strong opinion, 48% of the sample. They are around 0 in this graph. In contrast, this thick blue line shows people who responded as pro-Ukraine rational Democrats. Why am I saying so? On the COVID hoaxes dimension, they are very negative. They actually reject not only hoaxes, but also unbiased assumptions. So they are very immune to COVID hoaxes and superstitions. Pro-Russian politics, they they reject pro-Russian politics. They also absolutely reject self-centered economy. In fact, not only that they are not anti-Ukrainian, they are pro-Ukrainian, and not only that they are not selfish, but they are altruistic. They also, by the way, donated a lot of money and resources to the Ukrainians. They claim that we should self-sacrifice to some degree for the Ukrainians in their struggle. And with respect, to Russian guilt and responsibility, as I noted earlier, they don't quite agree in collective guilt, so they are kind of lukewarm on this dimension of Russian responsibility. An offspring of this dark blue thick line that represents 22% of the sample is this dashed line. You see, it's very anti-Russian. It rejects pro-Russian politics, and it's defined pretty much by the assumption that most Russians are responsible. And rather than by the way, it's kind of I call them rational Democrats light. They are a little bit less intense on self-centered economy rejection, and they are slightly falling for some superstitions on COVID, so they are closer to the zero. A mirror image of these two blue pro-democratic, anti-Russian and pro-Ukrainian ideology. A mirror image of that is this red line that is representing about 15% of respondents. And it shows some kind of a little bit going for the COVID superstitions and some hoaxes, but it's very pro-Russian, and it's very economically selfish, anti-Ukrainian. And of course, being pro-Russian, they absolutely reject that Russians would have any responsibility or guilt. And from the point of view of disinformation, this dashed line is interesting. Not many people, 9%, but still extremely high on subjection to both COVID hoaxes. Here, extremely high, and to a great degree also to Russian propaganda, typical for generally disinformed. We call them generally disinformed. So I should also stress that all these statistics is not on 1,000, but on 490 people that went through all those waves, about 4 or 5 waves we collected. This analysis is based on. So just fast pace walk through the validation of our typology, because we wanted to make sure that the types behave in an expected way in response to also other relevant items of our longitudinal survey. So we looked at questions on democracy, on how people viewed historical events, help to Ukraine, attitude to Russians, populism, health behavior, etc. So just briefly, this is validation. This is kind of a validity check, how the 5 types or mentalities or ideologies, identities maybe to a great degree, how do they respond in other items, questions that are absolutely non-related, that they were not part of the analysis. So this is independent check. Check on the Democrats. How important is it for you to live in a country which is governed democratically? You know, this typical question. And here you see the Democrats, especially the pro-Ukrainian Democrats, 2/3 of them extremely important. Democracy is extremely important to them. This was wave 1, that was COVID 2020 wave. In wave 8, we asked the same question. And this is kind of interesting because, of course, it confirms again that the Democrats, yes, for them, it's extremely important to have democracy. But what is interesting here is also the comparison between wave 1 and wave 8, because the wave 8 is after the Russian invasion. So you see how President Putin managed to increase the importance of democracy across, in at least it shows nicely in the Czech sample. Importance of democracy increased dramatically after the Russian invasion. Evaluation of the Velvet Revolution of the 1989 change to democracy, toppling of communism. Of course, the Democrats, again, absolute majority viewed the revolutions very positively. And here is a confirmation that the pro-Russian post-communists, as we call them, saw the democratic change quite often very negatively. Quarter of them, actually more than that, about a third of them, well, didn't like it. Evaluation of the election of Václav Havel, the former dissident. Of course, the Democrats welcomed that. The communists were upset by that to a great deal. Another reality check. Your evaluation of the entry of Warsaw Pact troops. I don't know. It's important for the Czechs. 1968 invasion that destroyed the democratic attempt. It was crushing the democratic movement back in 1968. Democrats still remember it. Most of them, actually almost all of them, rejected that invasion. The pro-Russian post-communists were more lukewarm about it. And the funny thing, the generally disinformed people, generally disinformed about COVID and Russian propaganda, quarter of them was not even able to judge it, admitted that they don't know how to judge it. So you see this generally disinformed type is fairly nicely confirmed by a historical question that is totally unrelated to COVID or the current events. Were you personally involved in volunteer help to Ukraine and Ukrainians? Anti-Russian Democrats very much so, pro-Ukrainian Democrats very much so, generally disinformed people not, pro-Russian post-communists not that much. Even more striking is whether they would like to help by delivering weapons. Democrats would. The ignorant and the pro-Russians wouldn't, etc. Attitudes to Russians before the 2020 invasion. This is interesting. This shows that the anti-Russian Democrats actually didn't like Democrats even before the invasion of Ukraine. So this is just showing, again, kind of a validity check on the anti-Russian Democrats type. And again, the pro-Russian post-communists and generally disinformed people are voting for populist countries. I will not go to details about what countries, what parties they are, and for the populist politicians. Yeah, this is another, Democrats versus populists. I will not go to, maybe this is interesting. Most of the serious problems do have a simple solution, let's have the courage to admit that. So simple solution for serious problems. The generally disinformed very much so agree with it. Pro-Russian post-communist also somewhat, but Democrats don't see simple solutions to serious problems. Another populistic validity check. I love politicians who say straight what is black or white and are not nuancing. Again, those disinformed and pro-Russians agree with it fully. I will not go to trust. Humanistic and moral deficit. Pro-Ukrainian Democrats, majority of them trust two people. You see the other types not that much at all. People behave to each other better now during the crisis. Again, generally disinformed and pro-Russian post-communists disagree. The Democrats see people in more benevolent way. Attitude to, and maybe last validity check here. We gave people in the sample 3 logical puzzles. kind of like, hyacinths grow on the pond and they double every day. When will the pond will be, that kind of, when will the pond be half covered? So kind of 3 logical puzzles, and the generally disinformed failed in 75, 3/4 failed and were not able to respond a single one. And the Democrats were much more successful in the logical puzzles. So that's kind of a validity check. So deficit in health behavior, of course, another, yeah. So overall conclusions, we were able to identify consistent and valid psychopolitical identities or mentalities based on expressed civility, decency, and attitudes to democracy in the study 1. And based on misinformation and disinformation in study 2. Overall conclusions, number 2. Interesting, in case of the Czech Republic, the 2 very dissimilar studies appear to yield a similar result. In study 1 in Central Europe, we saw, kind of a warning sign of half of the population. Some had somewhat non-democratic, skeptical feeling, and we saw the same ratio in the second study. Democrats about 28% or 29%, anti-democrats about 1/4 of the population, or 16% here. It's kind of interesting to see some resonance of these results. Of course, I should stress that if somebody responds in a survey as non-democratic skeptic, that may not necessarily mean that they are at their core non-democratic. We know that they are just often skeptical because of the current events, but when the situation is right, they do show democratic tendencies. But it's a warning sign in any case. And the third point, focus on group mentalities appears relevant to political culture research and may bring interesting and useful results. So thank you for your attention. So I think I managed with 3/4 of an hour. Yeah.